Hello, I'm David Timmons. Sorry I couldn't join you guys in Athens, but regardless, I hope you enjoy this presentation on validating the Assimilation Canadian Hierarchic Ionospheric Model, or A-CHAIM. This is work that's based off of the data assimilation system that's being developed by Ben Reed at the University of New Brunswick and supported by these various funding agencies. So I'll start off with some background information on the background model that's used for A-CHAIM before talking about the assimilation system and doing some performance test scenario assessments. We then look at a more long-term assessment of the performance of the system for talking about how performance behaves across different temporal and spatial scales. And I'll finish up with a brief discussion about some new features that we've been adding to the system. So A-CHAIM is based off of E-CHAIM, or the Empirical Canadian Hierarchic Ionospheric Model. It's an empirical model of the high latitude electron density above 50 degrees north geomagnetic latitude. And it's built on a really large and extensive data set of high latitude observations and it's ultimately designed to be an alternative to the use of the IRI at high latitudes. And more specifically, it was designed with funding support from DRDC, or Defense Research Development Canada, to support HF propagation studies. And so the A-CHAIM is really built with a focus on ensuring that it is an optimal form for use in HF propagation. So no discontinuities, it's doubly differentiable, things of that order. A-CHAIM uses E-CHAIM as a base, its background model, as well as its basis set for its state space. So we've effectively, instead of using a grid like most conventional data assimilation systems or models, we use a parameterized vertical structure and horizontal structure. So the vertical in A-CHAIM is given by the same functions that define E-CHAIM's vertical structure, and the horizontal is given by spherical cap harmonics. So effectively, you can consider A-CHAIM as an update to the coefficients of E-CHAIM, however, allowing for higher resolutions. So we don't actually stick to the same number of spherical cap harmonics that E-CHAIM internally uses. Now this, because we're not using a grid and we're using these spherical cap harmonics and this vertical parameterization, our state space is actually quite small compared to conventional data assimilation. You know, instead of millions of voxels, we have a few hundred or 1,000 parameters. And so this means that the system can actually be fairly computationally efficient, which is great for real-time application. We're talking about using this for a real-time operational model. However, by going to that parameterized state space, we've made the problem, or the data assimilation problem, far more nonlinear. And so in order to get by this nonlinear problem, we use a particle filter instead of the conventional Kalman filter approach or variational approach that most other data assimilation systems use. The specific flavor of Kalman filter, or of a particle filter that we use, is an auxiliary particle filter, and it also has this advantage that we don't need to assume Gaussian statistics. So particularly at high latitudes where you have a lot of intermittent structuring, that becomes quite important. We also can assimilate, more diverse data sets. We don't need to have a linear mapping between our state space and our measurements. So we can assimilate, HF propagation data from, say, SuperDARN. We can assimilate ryometer measurements. We can assimilate all these different diverse indirect measurements of the ionosphere into the system as well, rather than just being able to assimilate direct measurements or total electron content. Another advantage to this, or another kind of feature that we've incorporated into the system, is that we actually solve the instrumental biases of, say, GNSS as part of the state space. So some of the actual majority of the variables that we're solving for when we do these effectively a fit, this particle filter, is for the receiver biases of GNSS. But ultimately, this is the best approach to solve these biases, as we don't have to make any assumptions about the structure of the ionosphere. We don't have to use a thin shell. We don't have to do any of that. Those potentially problematic assumptions that can cause conventional or bias estimation techniques to have themselves biases. So, in terms of workflow, the system works by on every hour, we go back 3 hours, and we reprocess forward 3 hours, and then do a 2-hour forecast. So for any given time, so for example, here you can see this is our start time, we go back 3 hours, and then we assimilate forward 5. So we have a 2-hour forecast and then a 3-hour reanalysis, where we have very, very different data statistics or availability statistics within that 3-hour interval. So if you take any cross-section in time, you can see that you will actually have 5 different realizations of the ionosphere for every individual time. So one will be a 3 to 2 hour hindcast. The next will be a 1 to 2 hour hindcast. The next will be a 0 to 1 hour reanalysis or hindcast. And then we have a 0 to 1 hour forecast and a 1 to 2 hour forecast. So there are 5 different outputs from this system for any given time. There's also a retrospective version of this, or a reanalysis version of this system, that allows you to just choose a period that you want analyzed. And it grabs data from more diverse data sets. So in situ electron density data from, say, SWARM, DMSP, inquiry and scatter radar data, non-neural time POD tech from various satellite missions, as well as radio occultation data. At the moment, the data that's actually incorporated into A-CHAIM is given by these kind of maps here. So we have a number of different ionozones that contribute to the system in near real time, generally with latencies less than 20 minutes or so, an hour for some of the Russian ionozones. The red mark stations that are assimilated, and blue are stations that aren't available in real time, and so are processed in post to use for validation. And of course, this Seduncular one is excluded, so we don't have an overlap. Here we have the GNSS, or ground-based GNSS receivers that are used in the assimilation system in near real time. And at the bottom, we have an example of the altimeter data that's assimilated into the system. However, the availability of this data is quite intermittent. So when we talk about a near real-time system, we have a lot of complications. One of which being substantially reduced data. Another of which being we don't necessarily have real-time drivers for our background model. A-CHAIM has a storm parameterization that depends on AP index, DST, AE, PC. And also processing of GNSS data and other data sets in real time can be quite challenging. This is just to give an example of some of that. So one of the most kind of problematic challenges is the fact that you rapidly lose data. So you go from a fairly robust data environment to having very few measurements that you can assimilate into the system quite quickly as you go towards the current time. So here in the top we have the number of GNSS receivers that are assimilated into the system. In the middle we have ionozones, and then on the bottom we have the altimetry data. And ultimately, what you see is we lose about an order of magnitude, or close thereto, of GNSS receivers as we go from 3 hours in the past to 2 hours in the past to 1 hour in the past, or to within an hour, sorry, within 2 hours, within 3 hours. The ionozone data, we don't see quite as drastic of a loss. In general, the Ionospheric data, if the measurement's been made, it becomes available within a few minutes. And you know, kudos to the Ionospheric community for I guess ensuring the near real-time availability of their data sets. And then JSON, as I mentioned before, is highly intermittent and usually only captured in about the 2 to 3 hour latency range. So we have a data set that is rapidly fluctuating in terms of its availability. And so can lead to some challenges when trying to do data assimilation. Now, before I talk about validating that system, the first thing that I really need to talk about is, well, what is the error budget of the background model? So the whole point of data assimilation is to improve upon the background model. If you don't know what the error statistics of the background model are, you don't know where you can actually get improvement and where you shouldn't expect it at all. So I have this plot on the right from our 2021 paper where we looked at the performance of A-CHAIM in representing total electron content versus geomagnetic latitude on the y-axis and day of year or month of year on the x-axis, where these are overall RMS errors. The bottom is the same thing for the IRI, keeping in mind that the color scale here is different by a factor of 2. But what you'll note is that in general, within the polar cap and auroral oval, particularly at low solar activity, A-CHAIM's performance is generally into the measurement noise level. However, when you get to high solar activity, or if you go to lower latitudes, so suborbital latitudes or mid-latitudes, the system's performance converges roughly to that of the IRI. And we see, considerably larger errors. And so this is where we can get improvement with data assimilation. This is where we're expecting to be able to improve the model, is really at those suborbital and mid-latitude regions. Before talking about validation, I also want to kind of mention some kind of basic principles that I like to follow when doing doing validation, particularly of data assimilation systems and also of near real-time systems. It's very easy to assimilate total electron content and then leave out a few GNSS receivers and validate against total electron content. The problem with that is that ultimately that does not challenge your system's ability or I guess capacity to redistribute information within the state. Comparing or assessing an assimilation system with a measurement that is identical or very similar to a measurement that's assimilated is not really challenging, or is not assessing the system, or not assessing the utility of the system. It's, a tech map can get you tech from tech. You don't need an assimilation system for that. What you need an assimilation system for is to redistribute that information and get you other pieces of information about the state, like the height of the ionosphere, or the peak density of the ionosphere, or the top side of the ionosphere. And so, in general, while I will be comparing to some extent against some like measurements, we do not want to validate assimilation systems using measurements that resemble the data that was assimilated. So don't validate tech or tech assimilation with tech. Don't validate ionophone assimilation against NMF2 and HMF2 from ionosophones. Unless you have to, unless it's a tech map, right? If you want to assess the actual performance of the system in redistributing information and getting you something other than the thing that you put into it, you need to assess it against something that doesn't look like that. As I mentioned before, operational model performance or near real-time systems is really fundamentally different from what you'll see in scenario testing. So, data and processing, availability of data, all these things are going to have considerable influence on the assimilation system. And so, if you want to assess an operational system, you have to assess it in the context of an operational in an operational system. You have to give it data as it would look in near real time. As I mentioned before, also the availability of model drivers and so on. You can't synthetically assess these systems that are supposed to ostensibly saying that this is their real-time performance without testing them in that scenario. Testing outside of real-time or non-real-time output is great for model development, but it's not so useful for operational performance testing or telling a user this is how accurate my system will be. Now, I just said that that it's a bad thing to compare, like measurements. So, assimilate NMF2 for my Ionospheric and then compare the NMF2. But I'm going to do just that. And really just as a sanity check. So here we have FOF2 from the data in red, A-CHAIM in black, and then the various different realizations of A-CHAIM in the colors from blue to yellow, going from largest latencies, so hindcast, into forecast. The top is from pond inlet, and the next one is from Svalbard, so we're going poor cap, cusp, Seduncula's auroral or lower auroral oval or subauroral. And then we have Blissville in North America. On the right, we have the same thing, but now where we've removed the background model. So it just allows us to highlight some of the smaller scale variability of the performance of the system. So you'll note if we look at these anomalies with respect to the background, the simulation systems at Blissville and Seduncula do a really great job at following the measurement variability on these relatively smaller timescales. Effectively, at mid latitudes, the system is doing exactly what we expect. It's reducing the error in the places where we have the largest errors, and it's debiasing the background model. As we tend towards Svalbard, which there's really only one GNSS receiver near Svalbard being assimilated, you can see that we do have a little bit of improvement, but ultimately it's a bit of a wash. At Pond Inlet, where we have a little bit more data nearby, we can see that we're doing better than we are at Svalbard, but obviously, the variability of the ionosphere on short timescales than the poor caps precludes our ability to improve it too much farther than we're currently doing. We do the same thing for HMF2, and you can see again Blissville, we're getting a considerable improvement or debiasing the background model in HMF2. Interestingly, Svalbard, even though there are no measurements nearby it whatsoever, we're seeing a considerable improvement in HMF2 performance at that location. And this comes partially from the fact that our basis set is global. So every state member is actually defined globally. And so we can actually communicate information from say, auroral latitudes to the polar cap if that communication exists, or if the correlation length scales are sufficient to drive that improvement. So it turns out with HMF2, the correlation length scales from the polar cap and auroral oval regions are actually quite large, and so we can get improvement even in places where we don't have any data simply by assimilating measurements from say 1,000 kilometers away. And then Pond Inlet, we see a bit of a wash. We get some improvement, but it's not huge. And again, mostly due to the poor cap being, more highly dynamic. These are an overall summary of those tables from before. So we have Pond Inlet, Svalbard, and Blissville for HMF2 from A-CHAIM on the various different latencies, E-CHAIM on the different latencies, and then the absolute difference where improvement is negative. And the percentage difference. So in general, we get an improvement of 10 to 15% in the 2-hour reanalysis, and even in the forecast, 2-hour or 1 to 2 hour forecast, we're getting improvements of 4 to 12% in the HMF2 specification at our test locations. In terms of FOF2, you can see much the same. So we get 15% improvement upon Inlet with a degrading of that improvement as we go into forecast, as we'd expect. We get very little or no improvement or detriment as we look at Svalbard, where we just don't have enough data to be able to do anything. And then at Seduncula, you can see 30 to 40 to even close to 50% improvement of FOF2 with respect to the background model. And in Blissville, North America, where there's a huge abundance of data, even going into the real time, we're still seeing 50 to 60% improvements in RMS, with performance then degrading to only a 20% improvement as we go into a 2-hour forecast. We can do, rather than assessing against things that are like the measurements that we're assimilating, we can also assess against in situ measurements from DMSP. So the top are RMS errors for the various different latencies from A-CHAIM. The middle is A-CHAIM, and the bottom are the differences, where again negatives imply improvement. And you can see, overall, there's a substantial improvement over the background model through assimilating electron density measurements. So we're improving the top side by assimilating TEC and ionosphere-derived HMF2 FOF2. Generally, this goes from a 30% improvement in the hindcast to about a 10% improvement as we go into 1 to 2 hour forecast. Now that was just for a test period that we're doing in September 2021, but we can do this over all periods that we had available. So again, A-CHAIM, A-CHAIM, and then the difference, and you can see universally, when you're not doing with smaller scale structuring, or when you're averaging out the small errors that we get at the edges of small scale structures, you can see that we've universal improvement at DMSP, and the same at swarm, where the majority of our improvement, or the largest portions of our improvement, come at mid and suborbital latitudes, particularly over North America. Now, the last thing I want to talk about in terms of validation is this concept of validating not just overall RMS improvement, but also on these different timescales. It's important to understand, is an assimilation system, or is this model getting you, getting you smaller temporal timescale variability? The IRI and A-CHAIM, without any storm models turned on, they're climatological. The small scales that they can resolve are, obviously diurnal scales, but when we talk about intermediate scales, 1 to 30 day, they're really only capable of resolving about 30-day time scales. You turn on storm models and you can get smaller temporal variability, generally in the order of 7-day time scales or so. Data assimilation should allow us to incorporate or to resolve much smaller temporal scales. So what you can do is you can take all of the data that we've had, or all of the data we've had from the system since March 2021 through to the end of, or September 2022, or sorry, October 1st, 2021. And you can do effectively a quasi wavelet transform on that. So this is what you get from the observations, where we have period here on the y-axis and they have day of year on the x-axis. And you can see that there's a considerable amount of variability here on timescales within 10 days. You also see a considerable amount of variability on solar rotation timescales over here between 20 and 30 days. A-CHAIM, as you'll note, has considerably less variability on those solar rotation timescales and very little variability on these 1 to 10 day timescales, although it does get a little bit here in September. A-CHAIM, as we hoped, improves our representation of those within 10-day timescale variations. So we get a considerable, pretty good representation anyway, of these mid-amplitude, 1 to 10 day period oscillations or variabilities in the ionosphere. If we sum these across each period, you can get these spectrograms where we have period on the y-axis and amplitude on the x-axis. Blue is A-CHAIM, red is A-CHAIM, and black is observation. And you can see in general, the assimilation takes us from considerably underestimating variability on these times across these intermediate timescales to doing considerably better. However, we still lack some improvement on intermediate timescales. So just one last thing that I'll talk about, which is some new kind of features that we've incorporated into the simulation system recently. We've put in solar inject proton assimilation, so this gets us the enhanced absorption in the lower D region, or mid to lower D region, as a result of solar inject proton precipitation. The exact method that we're using for this is really just an implementation of Rogers 2016. Where we go from GOES solar inject proton spectra down here, and we brute force calculate the pair production rates, and then assume some effective recombination rates to get the anomaly or the contribution to electron density in the D region resulting from the solar inject proton ionization. We've then done some comparisons to riometer measurements of absorption. So here's the solar inject proton contribution to electron density in log electron density for a period in September 2017 versus altitude. The middle is the attenuation, so dB per kilometer absorption associated with that electron density. And the bottom in black is the modeled solar inject proton absorption, and the red is the observed absorption. You can see we have pretty good correspondence between the two during this event. Even before doing any data assimilation, we're actually beating DRAP, the NOAA operational model. This is another comparison at Resolute, where you can see red is actually Wacom-D, blue is A-CHAIM, or this solar inject protons without data assimilation, and then black is the observation, keeping in mind that the riometer went to saturation above 10 dB. But you can see we're doing, okay, we're still significantly underestimating the absorption in this event, and so we want to improve that through data assimilation. I don't have much time, so I won't talk about this much, but this is just a comparison with incurrent scatter radar of the vertical structure of the electron density increase due to solar inject proton ionization. And here we have the assimilation results. So we assimilate riometer data into A-CHAIM, given by the red. Blue is the background model, so no assimilation, solar inject protons, and black is the observation. You can see, we get considerably better representation of this absorption through assimilating riometer measurements from other riometers in Canada and Norway. We've also incorporated the absorption or the assimilation of precipitation measurements from SUSY on DMSP, which allows us to go from our climatological representations of the auroral oval and A-CHAIM to much more structured and dynamic representations of the auroral oval in our assimilation system. So we can get much more smaller scale variability or structuring in the assimilation system by incorporating these SUSY measurements. And with that, all this to say, we've developed an assimilation system, we validated it, it's doing better than the background model universally. It works. This is a completely new technique. This is something that no one else in our field has tried doing particle filters. So we're quite happy that the system fundamentally works. And there are a lot of new features that we're incorporating into the system, and that we're trying to incorporate more diverse data sets now that we've ensured that the method actually works. And the system's been operational since March 2021, and in fact was operational before that in a previous version. But the background model is freely available here, and then the output from the assimilation system is freely available here as well. We provide distributions in CMATLAB and IDL, and if you want more information about the system, you can check out Ben's paper here that's been submitted to Space Weather in preprint. If you have any questions, please send me an email at david.timmons@gmail.com. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person to get your questions, but please, I'm very happy to reply to emails. Thank you.